So let's look at working with circles. So a circle is a set of all points in a plane that are the same distance from a fixed point called the center. So this is an important piece of all this. There's this fixed point. The easiest way to construct a circle, a good circle, if I'm trying to do that is there's what's called a compass. So there is a tool we can use on the computer here. Let's see if I can get to this website. So there's this website called chintzy.com, and there's this little tools in here that we can click on, and there's some math tools that we can use. There's all kinds of stuff here that we can use. What I'm interested in is the compass, because the compass is used to draw circles. So if I can drag this out here a little bit, see if we can get this to work for us here. You can kind of use this button here to make it the circle smaller or bigger if you want. Again, you can just grab it anywhere and move it around. And let's see what this does here. That just kind of moves it that way, that way. Not much going on there. But if I want to draw a circle, notice how this sharp point is going to be the center of the circle, and this little spot over here is going to be the actual circle. So if I grab the tip of this little guy and rotate it around, notice how it will actually draw me a nice, pretty circle. So now let me get this out of the way. We can put this in the trash can. So notice how we have a circle. And let me just pick out a color here. Let's see, we'll pick red. So the center of the circle, it can be any letter. Let's just call it, um, a lot of times they'll use O for the center. So if O is the center, and if I go to a point on the circle, A, from O to A, that distance would be the same as if I went from O to, say, call this point over here B. So from the center to a point on the circle, this distance will always be the same. And these distances, again, there are infinitely many points on the circle, so there's tons and tons of these little distances. These distances are called radiuses or radii. So one of the radiuses is, or radii, if you will. So radius would be from the center to a point on the circle. So notice how it's a line segment. So from O to A would be considered a radius. Now, if you go from one point through the center to another point across the way, say this is point C, notice that if you draw a line segment that goes through the center of the circle all the way across to the other side of the circle, so notice that both point A and point C are on the circle. This line segment has a name for it. It's called a diameter. So a diameter is a special segment that goes through the center of the circle. So segment AC, if you will, be considered a diameter. And notice that if we talk about the diameter, notice how OA is a radius, but notice how now OC is a radius. So notice how these two segments, OA plus OC, in other words, a radius plus a radius would be the same thing as a diameter. So a diameter can also be defined as two radii, if you will. So another thing we have going on are what we call arcs. So an arc is traveling on the circle itself. So if I go from here over to here, that would be considered an arc. So an arc means you're moving on the circle itself. So here we can say that arc is AB. Now notice how that would be considered like a minor arc. The major arc would be the counter side of that. So instead of going from A to B, if I went from A through C back to B, if you will. Sorry for my, let me see if I can erase that a little bit. Probably gets a little dangerous. See if I can make a small eraser. See if I can be a little bit neater, but not much. This is hard to do freehand. So again, if I start at A, go through C, and come up here to B, the flip side of that is called the major arc. So if I say from A to C to B, that would be the other side of that. That's actually considered the major arc. Another thing circles have are what we call chords. So a chord is a line segment. So if I go from B to A, that line segment is called a chord. So a chord joins any 2 points on the circle, but it's a line segment. So line segment AB would be described as a chord. Or if I went from B to C, that would be a chord because it's joining 2 points on the circle. Notice that AC is a special chord. It's also called the diameter. So the diameter can also be called a chord. Some other things we could say we have here is we can say we have what's called a sector. A sector is when we have a radius and another radius. So if we'll call this point D. So if we have this radius OA and this radius OD, and we have this arc AD, notice how they enclose this region. So we have this closure. That closure, that region, if you will, is described as a sector. So a sector looks like a piece of pizza. So this little region here is described as a sector. It looks like a piece of pizza. So it's enclosed by two radii and an arc. So it's going to be a sector. Looks like a piece of pizza. Another thing we may come across is what's called a segment. So a segment is when we have a chord. Let's look at BC as a chord. The segment is the region between the chord and the arc, so the circle itself. So this region here would be described as the segment. So notice how this is a region like a piece of pizza. And this also is a region, but it doesn't look like a piece of pizza. So it's like an area, if you will. It's a region. So let's see here, if we go back to my document here. So we talked about a radius. It's a line segment going from the center to any point on the circle. And feel free to draw yourself a circle with the radius. So segment OA, if you will, a lot of times in our stuff here, we'll label with this little line on top of it, segment OA. It's going to be the distance from the center to a point on the circle. Notice how the diameter had to go through the center of the circle as well. So it's a segment. It has to go through the center of the circle, and it connects 2 points on the circle. And as we talked about, the diameter is the same thing as the length of two radii. So if you say D, that's the same thing as doubling the radius, if you will. A term I didn't mention was the circumference. The circumference is the distance all the way around the circle. So if I go back to my drawing, the circumference, if I start at point A and went all the way right back around to A, that distance is called the circumference. The circumference is not measured in degrees. It's actually measured in inches or centimeters and things like that. It's a linear measurement. So when we talk about the circumference, we're not talking about an angle in this situation. We're talking about how many inches or how many centimeters or how many miles that is. The circumference is also the same thing as the perimeter of a circle. Because remember, the word perimeter means the distance around an object. But when we talk about circles, it's called circumference. And again, to find the circumference, we actually have a formula. This one says C equals 2 pi r, but there's another one that you can say C is pi times the diameter. Because remember, 2r is the same thing as d. So we can drop the 2 and r out and replace it with the d. And remember, pi is a special number. If they want us to change pi to a number, usually we change it to 3.14. That's the special number we change it to. So we have that. We talked about a chord. Again, a chord is a segment that joins 2 points on a circle. A special chord was the diameter. Notice how the arc is not all the way around the circle. It's just part of the circumference. So again, we have this minor arc or major arc, if you will, and also, of course, a semicircle. Again, sector, we talked about that. That's the slice of pizza. And the segment is the region bounded by a chord and the arc. So again, if I draw that one out roughly, so if I draw a circle, hey, it's not too bad. If I draw, say, point X and point Y, if I join those together, that's a chord. And notice that this arc XY, the segment is actually the region between that chord and that arc, that area, if you will. Okay, so we have that going on there. Okay. So you can pause your video here and again, you could do a quick summary of those words. And again, you could draw pictures of each one to see if you've got that. That'd be a good thing to do. Let's see what else we have here. We do have a few more things going on here, but let me do that in a different video.